So William Janeway, whatever else you're going to say, it's all going to be very interesting. Please take up the subject of Europe for a moment and give your own view on it.
I will, although this doesn't count against my shortened 20 minutes, right?
Economists are generally very good negotiators.
I should say that as a venture capitalist for a long generation, temperamentally, I'm not allowed not to be an optimist, because otherwise, in my line of work, you'd cut your throat early on. And I do think, I think what Joschka Fischer just said, in invoking implicitly a transition that took place in my country from confederation to federation 220 years ago, there's actually an interesting inversion in that it was economic inadequacy, incoherence among the winning colonies of the American Revolution, who initially tied themselves so loosely into a confederation that had no coherence economically. And then it was Alexander Hamilton's genius, when the Federal Republic was established in the United States, to bind it together with a central bank, which didn't last very long, I have to tell you, but with the first bank of the United States, and this may be the point that goes to what George wrote in the FT today, with the binding force being the assumption of the debts of the separate colonies by the central government. And that's what got the United States going. And I think there's a very interesting analogy there. I'm going to shift gears in offering a perspective on what I call the first global crisis of big state capitalism. And with all respect to the great work of Ken Rogoff and Carmen Reinhardt, I'm going to talk about not just that this time it's different, but how this time it's different. And as I mentioned, I addressed this question from a particular perspective. 25 years ago, Chaim Minsky, of honored memory and rediscovered economist, used to refer to me as a theorist practitioner. And as such, I've been a student of the innovation economy from the inside out and the outside in, and observing and living the evolution of the innovation economy. Like George Soros, I see that evolution as the result of three sets of continuous, reciprocal, interdependent games played between the state, the market economy, and financial capitalism. Through the centuries, the state and the market economy have collaborated and they've competed in allocating resources and distributing income and wealth. As Karl Polanyi famously analyzed and illuminated, the free market economy itself was the result of positive and often quite ruthless state initiatives. And contrary-wise, losers in the market economy, whether employers or employees, whether creditors or debtors, those who lose, appeal to the state for protection from what to them is the ruthless power of markets. Another way of thinking about that three-player game was formulated recently by Danny Roderick at the Kennedy School in his extraordinary book, his too little absorbed book, The Globalization Paradox. And Danny Roderick's political trilemma, which sets as in opposition, in necessary opposition to each other, the desire simultaneously to maintain national autonomy, a representative democracy as the source of legitimacy for the state, and deep globalization, by which he means the integration of financial markets. Now, stepping back, 40 years ago, I wrote my doctoral dissertation on the last global crisis of small state capitalism. I wrote it for Richard Kahn, and consequently had an extraordinary reach back to the mindset, the context in which policy was developed. Institutionally, The first and most important element was the simple scale of the state. It was small. In the United States, it was vanishingly small. The total public sector in 1929 in the United States was about 9% of the national economy. 1.7% of that was represented by the federal government. The largest segment of state involvement in the economy were school teacher salaries paid and funded at the local level. Of course, the golden fetters, as Barry Eichengreen has written, required not only that the state not try to offset the collapse in the private sector occasioned by the global crisis in financial markets and institutions, it required that the state enforce financial discipline on the market economy to the extent that it could, and unemployment reached on the order of 25 to 30% across the entire developed world. The political response in that era was paralysis. Fiscal stimulus was blocked. It was blocked by the illusion of the Treasury dogma as articulated by the then Chancellor of the Exchequer in one of his numerous failures before his apotheosis as Prime Minister in World War II, Winston Churchill, who in stating the Treasury dogma, and he used that term, the dogma, that state borrowing and investment necessarily must preempt private investment, even in the context of massive unemployment of people, machines, factories, resources. Keynes won the argument at the time over the Treasury dogma. Intellectually, he won that argument. The Treasury repeated. Nonetheless, other arguments prevailed. Public works, to be legitimate, must be useful and productive, in the same terms as if they were being implemented by private capitalists, private entrepreneurs. And if they were not, the argument from confidence prevailed. It would shatter confidence in the private sector, in the financial markets, and ultimately, the gold standard would collapse, and with it, the framework of civilization. When the state proved incapable of not only not protecting the market economy from the collapse of financial capitalism, it became itself delegitimized. The political process in the United States was threatened by demagogues like Huey Long. In France, it was undermined, and the Third Republic became a hollow shell, and in Germany, it was overwhelmed. The gold standard did collapse, of course, and that in turn did allow some modest degree of recovery, but of course, it was mobilization for war that provided the legitimizing mission through which state intervention could restore full employment across the economies of the world. Now, Keynes had attempted, even before the general theory, to provide an independent rationale. And in his characteristic way, he put it in the most provocative terms possible in talking about how the Treasury could put banknotes into empty bottles of beer, bury them in disused coal mines, cover them over with municipal waste, and allow the profit motive of the private sector to dig them up, share the income, and produce economic growth. Of course, what he recognized was that in a persistently depressed economy, the marginal productivity of resources is negative. Skills atrophy, machines rust, factories, ceilings and roofs call in. Any employment would be less inefficient, whether it was for purposes that narrowly defined were, quote, useful and productive. And 4 years after the general theory, writing in the New Republic in the United States, Keynes looked back and, as I say, in a rueful reflection on what it would take in a capitalist democracy to try his experiment of state borrowing and spending to restore full employment. Now, 2008 ushered in this new crisis, the first crisis of big state capitalism. And it's different this time for a very simple reason. Versus the 20% or less that the public sector represented of the national economy 80 years ago, today it's 35 to 50%, even in the United States. The federal government is more than 20%, despite the endeavors of the Tea Party. And as a direct consequence, I would argue, this time unemployment has threatened a massive collapse as of 1931 to 33. This time unemployment only reached 8 to 10%, and the banking system was preserved from liquidation. Chaim Minsky wrote a book 25 years ago of extraordinary prescience. It has, I have to say, one of the least, how shall I put it, compelling titles of any really significant work of economic thought, Stabilizing an Unstable Economy. But he laid out how, in the context of what he called big government capitalism, 1931, 1933, it would not happen again. In addition to the triple role of fiscal deficits in offsetting the consequences, the economic consequences of financial collapse, Minsky, of course, also recognized the importance of a central bank intervention as lender of last resort. But he also very presciently pointed out that when financial excess was driven by financial innovation, merely to save the bankers from their own excesses wouldn't be enough. That looking seriously at those innovations, constraining them, limiting them, and he actually said perhaps abolishing them, would be necessary for the cycle not to repeat itself. Minsky was demonstrably correct, and the political response this time around has been mixed. Indeed, monetary initiatives have been aggressive. But even while the Treasury dogma has resurfaced only as a footnote promoted by a few, what I might say, self-marginalized Chicago boys, policy has nonetheless been constrained. Again, we saw it in the critiques, including critiques from modern macroeconomists of the Obama stimulus legislation as focused on areas that were not, quote, useful and productive. Again, almost as soon as the banking system had been stabilized, the argument from confidence reemerged. And of course, as we have already spent much of the day talking about, the golden fetters of the euro are very, very visible. And regulatory initiatives, the response to financial excess, have been muted. And as I say on the slide, with 25% unemployment, you get Glass-Steagall. With 10%, you only get Dodd-Frank. The political consequences I read as open, continuing, not yet to be fully realized. A state that is large enough and just vigorous enough to save the financial system in order to protect the market economy, thereby does and has exposed itself as necessarily and consequently insolvent. This is a reflexive irony in the realm of institutional interaction in that game between the state, the market economy, and financial capitalism that has not, in fact, previously been observed. That's, again, how this time it's different. And of course, we do have the danger, perhaps limited only to a small set of countries in the southern periphery of Europe, that for the state to take on the role as enforcer of financial discipline can, in fact, lead to the undermining, the delegitimization of the political process and send the political process into the streets. Now, the situation we're in does remain dynamic and it remains open. I cite work 20 years ago by our advisory board member, Joe Stiglitz, on the long-term consequences of a persistently depressed economy. There is feedback from the demand side to the supply side. Under conditions of sustained unemployment, underused resources, investment is in turn constrained, and the growth potential of the economy is undermined and reduced. Giovanni Dassi, who is here in the audience, has explicitly built on Stiglitz's insight and has been constructing the methodology of agent-based modeling to explore this interdependence of Schumpeter's world of innovation, the long-term driver of productivity and growth on the supply side of the economy, with Keynes's world, the world of aggregate demand on the relatively short term on the demand side of the economy, and has been demonstrating in this work how, again, this feedback from unemployment, underused resources, depressed economic conditions can be expected, and expected, I regret to say, with confidence, to reduce the growth potential of the economy and reduce the opportunity to earn our way back to balanced economic health. So, in this context, the economists' perennial pursuit of efficiency in the allocation of resources in the cross-section and in the intertemporal realm has a double-edged impact. I spoke about this a year ago at Bretton Woods. I think what we've been living through has confirmed the significance of this double-edged sword. It serves both to, the pursuit of efficiency serves both to restrain, undercut the toleration of the necessary waste, the productive waste, the Schumpeterian waste for growing the growth potential of the economy, at the same time as it encourages toleration of the waste that Keynes devoted the last half of his life to fighting, the waste of unemployed resources. Is there an alternative? Well, of course, we have two extraordinary case studies, existence proofs that there has been. Britain exited the Napoleonic Wars with debt equal to, state debt, sovereign debt equal to 250% of some estimates of national income. The US exited World War II with 120% national debt relative to GDP. In each case, those countries emerged from those world wars as the leaders in the innovation economy, as driving innovation and driving the deployment of new infrastructure and of new technological inventions. And the economies grew rapidly enough, even while the debt itself was not reduced. And in the US, it continued to grow, to reduce national debt as a percent of income to the very manageable, in fact, almost understated level of about 50%. So what's missing now? Well, first, I just want to reiterate what has come to me to be a fundamental thesis. After 100 years of welfare economics, from Pigou to Arrow, it is the case that market failure, and even the failure of markets on the scale of 1929 to 33 and 2008 through 2012, is insufficient by itself on its own to legitimize strategic state intervention in support of the market economy when it is most needed. In fact, only compelling missions that transcend the narrow confines of welfare economics and that gain political legitimacy have been capable of doing that. Historically, it's been national development, as in the 19th century Germany, and of course China today, or national security, as in post-World War II United States, that became the vehicles for state investment on the scale required. Today, I could not agree more with Joschka Fischer that we can already, even before we have built out the digital economy in its full richness, we can already see the nature and some of the content of the next new economy. It will be a low-carbon economy, and it will require state underwriting, state investment upstream to enable the unconstrained, entrepreneurial, speculative, and no doubt bubble-driven investment downstream, just as the world of the internet evolved. But today, we don't yet have the motivating mission. Sometimes I speculate that the president called for a Sputnik moment. We're more likely in American vernacular to need a Pearl Harbor moment. When we lose the Greenland ice cap and Palm Beach is under 3 meters of water, I have no doubt there will be a mass movement to address climate change after the fact. In the meantime, the financial markets remain sufficiently unrepressed to exhibit their schizoid volatility, moving between risk on and risk off. And those states with sufficient financial autonomy to sponsor growth versus austerity are subject to paralysis in the absence of that transcendent legitimizing mission. I began by saying that you can't have pursued the career I have for 40 years without being an optimist. And I look and hope that through this kind of engagement of people thinking and doing at this frontier, we can re-engender the hope that we can earn our way out of this situation through growth rather than constrain ourselves to extended political paralysis and economic repression. Thank you.
Thank you, William Janeway.